The morning Marcus Ford rode into Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory. The year was 1882, and he looked like a man who had been chewed up by the land and spat out without apology. His horse, a gray roan gelding named Cutter, moved with the slow, deliberate gait of an animal that had been pushed far and asked to keep going further still, and the man on its back was in no better shape. Marcus Ford was 31 years old, and he looked older by at least a decade, not in his face, which was lean and dark-stubbled and still carried the architecture of a handsome man, but in his eyes. His eyes were the color of creek water in autumn, a kind of gray-green that had seen too much open sky and too many sleeping rough nights, and not enough of the softer things that make a human being feel like one. He had been riding since before the snow melted in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, working cattle drives down from Colorado, spending weeks at a stretch under nothing but stars and the indifferent face of the moon. He had worked for 3 different outfits in the past 7 months, none of them staying, none of them asking him to stay. He was good with horses, good with his hands, quiet enough not to cause trouble, and utterly without roots. That was how he had come to this stretch of trail, following work, following nothing in particular, following whatever the next day brought. He had not eaten a warm meal inside 4 walls in months. That was not self-pity. That was simply a fact that lived in his bones, in the cold knot that sat in his belly every morning when he rolled his bedroll and started the fire from scratch, boiling coffee in a tin pot and eating salt pork that he'd cut himself before dawn. He knew how to make do. He had been making do since he was 16 years old, and his father's small ranch in Texas went under during a bad drought, and the family scattered like seeds in a hard wind. He had been making do every day since then, and he was good at it, the way a man gets good at things he has no choice about. But there was a tiredness in him that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with the particular loneliness of a man who had nowhere to go and no one waiting. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a main street that amounted to a hardware store, a dry goods shop, a livery, a saloon called the Painted Spur, a church at the far end that was losing the battle with a congregation that preferred the saloon, and a scattering of homes and homesteads arranged like an afterthought around the commercial center. The territorial railroad had bypassed it, which meant Harlan Creek was slowly contracting, the way places do when the future decides to go around them. It was not a dying town, not exactly, but it had the look of a town that had accepted its limitations and decided to be stubborn about surviving them. Marcus reined Cutter to a stop in front of the livery, dismounted with the careful movement of a man whose joints ached, and led the horse inside. He arranged for feed and a stall with a boy named Pete who had a gap in his front teeth and talked too much, paid what he owed from the thin roll of bills he kept in the breast pocket of his coat, and went out into the morning sun. He stood there on the street for a moment, blinking. He needed a meal. He needed a bath. He needed work if Harlan Creek had any to offer. And then he needed to keep moving because staying was not something he knew how to do. The Painted Spur did not open until noon. He found a dry goods store that had a small counter near the back where a woman sold biscuits and coffee, and he ate 2 biscuits standing up, which was fine but not warm, not the kind of warm that went into the bones. He drank the coffee and felt approximately human again. He asked the woman behind the counter if there was anyone in the area hiring. She thought about it with the careful expression of a woman sorting through a complicated card file in her head. John Reardon might have something out at his spread north of town, she said. Maybe. He lost 2 ranch hands to the silver mines last month. Everybody's going to the mines now. Anybody else? There's the Wilcox property south side of town, maybe 2 miles out. Woman named Wilhelmina Wilcox. She runs it herself since her husband died. Don't know if she's hiring, but she might be. She's proud, though. Don't go out there begging. Marcus nodded. He thanked the woman and walked back out into the street, and he stood again in the sun, turning this information over. He had learned in his years of drifting that the best opportunities were often the ones that seemed smallest at first. A widow running a property alone, out past the edge of a contracting town. He understood what that meant. It meant hard work with no guarantee of much pay. It meant a place where the work never finished. It also meant, possibly, a few days of reliable employment, and reliable employment was what he needed before he could figure out the next thing. He found his way to the Wilcox property in the late morning. The road that led out to it was rutted and dry, and the land on either side was scrubland with the occasional juniper and the particular kind of dry grass that turned gold in the New Mexico heat. The property itself announced itself with a fence line that needed 2 posts replaced and a gate that had been rehung at a slight angle, as if whoever had fixed it had been in a hurry or had done it alone. But the fences were mended, and the land beyond them was tended. There were chickens in a coop near the barn, and a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that was green and serious and clearly cared for. The barn was solid. The house itself was a single-story adobe with a porch across the front and window boxes that had been planted with something small and purple that Marcus did not know the name of, but that struck him, oddly, as brave. He tied Cutter to the post at the gate and walked up to the porch and knocked. She came to the door and stopped there, one hand on the frame, looking at him with eyes that were sharp and dark brown and did not miss anything. She was not what he expected, though he told himself later he had not had expectations. Wilhelmina Wilcox was 28 years old, and she had the kind of face that would have been called handsome in a woman who came from money and merely striking in a woman who did not. Her dark hair was pinned up but not neatly, in the way of a woman who had more urgent things to attend to than her hair. She wore a plain gray dress and an apron that had flour and something red on it, and she stood in her doorway like a woman who was not afraid of strangers but was not in the habit of welcoming them carelessly either. "Can I help you?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm looking for work," Marcus said. He took his hat off, which he always did. "Name's Marcus Ford. I'm a ranch hand. I worked cattle drives up through Colorado and before that in Texas. I know horses, fences, structures if they need mending. I'm told you might be in need of help." She looked at him the way a woman looks at a horse she's considering buying, not with cruelty but with practical assessment. "Who told you that?" "Woman at the dry goods in town." "Clara Briggs," Wilhelmina said, more to herself than to him. She looked past him at the horse tied to her gate and then back at his face. "How long you been on the road?" He thought about lying or softening it and decided there was no point. Most of the winter and spring. Something shifted very slightly in her expression and then settled again. "I can offer room and board and $12 a month," she said. "No more than that right now. There's a room in the barn, not fancy, but it keeps out the wind. Work starts before sunrise and ends when the work ends. I don't have patience for men who pace themselves for a shorter day than I keep." "I don't pace myself." "We'll see about that," she said. And then, with a tone that was about as warm as a business transaction but contained within it some small and careful thing that was not entirely businesslike, "Have you eaten today?" "Some biscuits in town." She looked at him again, that same level assessment. "Come around back. I've got soup on the stove that needs using." He followed her around the side of the house because she did not invite him in, and she did not do it with unkindness. She did it with efficiency, which was its own kind of respect. She went inside through the back door, and a moment later she came out onto the porch with a bowl of soup and a piece of bread set on a plain white plate, and she set it on the porch rail and stepped back inside. She did not make a ceremony of it. Marcus sat down on the porch step and ate the soup, and it was the first warm meal he had eaten inside 4 walls, or almost inside 4 walls, in longer than he could clearly remember. The soup was thick with beans and dried chili and some kind of dried meat, and the bread was heavier than it would have been made with better flour, but it was warm, and it tasted like something made with care for the purpose of sustaining a human body, and that meant more than he could have put into words even if he'd had the inclination, which he did not. He ate it without saying much, and when he was done he set the bowl back on the rail and said, "Much obliged." She appeared in the doorway then, drying her hands on the apron. "You can start this afternoon," she said. "The fence along the east pasture needs work and the barn door hinge is going. I'll show you where the tools are." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And that was how it began. For the first 2 weeks, Marcus Ford worked from before sunrise to after sunset, and he worked the way a man works when he has something to prove, not to another person but to himself. He repaired the fence posts along the east pasture, and then the north side where the wire had rusted and was no longer keeping the small herd of cattle, 7 cows and a bull and 3 calves, from wandering. He replaced the barn door hinge, and then noticed the roof of the barn had a section that was sagging and fixed that before it became a problem. He cleared a drainage channel that had silted up along the south side of the property and was threatening to flood the kitchen garden when it rained. He did all of this quietly and thoroughly, and when he did not know how to do something, he figured it out. Wilhelmina watched all of this and said little, which suited him, because he was not a man who needed conversation to feel comfortable. But he watched her too, in the way one person watches another when they are trying to understand how things work in a new place. He watched her move through her days with a kind of fierce, compressed energy that never quite stopped. She was up before he was, every morning. She tended the kitchen garden, kept the chickens, managed the small herd, did her own cooking and mending, and the 100 other things that running a homestead required. She also, he discovered, kept a ledger. On evenings when the light was still good, she would sit on the porch with the ledger and work through it with a pencil, her brow furrowed in concentration, adding and subtracting with a precision that told him she had been watching every cent for a long time. Her husband, Wilhelmina Wilcox, had died 2 years ago. He had gone out riding in an early winter storm, a storm that turned bad faster than anyone expected, and the cold had taken him before he could get back. He was 32. They had been married 4 years. There were no children. Marcus learned this from Pete at the livery, who was young and had not yet developed the discretion to know what information was offered and what was pried loose. Marcus did not ask for more. He had what he needed to understand the outline of her situation, and the outline was this. She was alone and she had chosen to stay and fight for what she had, and she was doing it with a ferocity that was quiet enough that most people in town probably underestimated it. He did not underestimate it. He ate his meals on the porch, which she brought out to him without comment, and he did not presume to ask for anything more. He understood this arrangement, understood that there was a line, and he stayed on his side of it with care. It was not that he was indifferent to her, because he was not, but he was not a man who moved toward things impulsively, and she was not a woman who gave anything impulsively, and so they existed in this arrangement of mutual, careful distance. It was on a Tuesday in May, 3 weeks into his employment, that the distance began, very slowly, to shift. He was working on the water pump near the barn, which had started to drag and give less water than it should. It was a hot afternoon, the kind where the air went still and the whole landscape seemed to lean into the heat, and he was lying on his back in the dirt with his arm inside the pump housing, trying to reach a fitting that had come loose, when she appeared and crouched down a few feet away and said, without preamble, "There's a second fitting deeper in to the left. It's what usually goes before the outer one." He worked his hand further in, felt it, and got his fingers around it. "Thank you." "Ilias used to fight that pump every spring," she said. She said it the way people say things they have decided to say because the silence around the name has lasted long enough and they are choosing to end it. "Was it new when you came here?" "We put it in the first year," she said. "Thought we were being very modern." There was a thread of dry humor in her voice, the kind that had to be there because the alternative was grief, and she had clearly decided some time ago not to live inside the grief anymore, even if she could not entirely put it down. "We were very proud of that pump." "It's a good pump," Marcus said, and pulled his arm out and stood up and worked the handle. Water came up strong and clear. "There." She looked at the water with the expression of someone who has solved a problem and is already moving to the next one, but then she looked at him, and for just a moment the efficiency stepped aside and something else was there. Not sentiment exactly, or not only that, recognition, as if she was seeing him, the actual him, for the first time rather than just the function he was filling. "Come inside and wash up," she said. "I'll put coffee on." He followed her inside. This was the first time he had been inside the house, and he looked at it the way he looked at most things, carefully, and without making a production of it. It was a single main room with a kitchen at one end, and a table and 2 chairs, and a settee that had been patched in 2 places, and a bookshelf with a serious number of books on it. There were dried flowers hanging from a beam near the window, and a rag rug on the floor in a pattern of red and blue and brown. It was a room that had been made into a home with intention and care and very little money, and it had a warmth to it that was not only the warmth of the stove. She put the coffee on, and he washed his hands at the basin, and they sat at the table across from each other and drank coffee, and she asked him questions he answered straight, where he had worked, what he knew, where he had come from originally, and he answered all of it without elaborating or hedging, because she was asking practical questions and he had practical answers. He asked her about the herd, whether she was planning to expand it, whether she had thought about the cattle market in Albuquerque. She answered him with the specificity of a woman who had thought about all of these things in careful detail, and simply had not had anyone useful to think through them with. When he stood to go, she said, "You can come inside for meals if you want. No sense in carrying plates out to the porch." He looked at her. He understood what she was offering, and it was not entirely practical. "I'd appreciate that," he said. And so the porch meals ended and the inside meals began. This was a small thing and a large thing at the same time. Marcus Ford ate his meals at Wilhelmina Wilcox's table, and she sat across from him, and they talked, sometimes about the property and sometimes about other things, and the silence between topics was the comfortable kind that neither of them felt obliged to fill. He discovered that she had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and had come west with Elias when she was 22, which meant she had been west for 6 years now, and had fully become a woman of this land without losing the sharpness that the schoolteacher's daughter had always had. She read, genuinely and widely, which he could see from the bookshelf. She had opinions about things. She expressed them without seeking approval. He told her, more than he usually told anyone, about Texas and the ranch going under and the years of moving, working one outfit and then the next. He told her about the cattle drives, the weeks on the trail, the nights sleeping out, the particular feeling of being in constant motion without direction. He did not say in so many words that he was tired of it. He did not need to. She heard it anyway. In June, a man came out from town to look at the Wilcox property. His name was Douglas Hale, and he was, in the parlance of the territory, a land speculator, which was a polite way of saying he was a man who had money and wanted land that other people were struggling to hold, and he bought it from them at prices that were fair only to him, and then sold it at prices that confirmed how unfair the original purchase had been. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in a buggy that was too nice for the road, wearing a coat that cost more than Wilhelmina's monthly expenses, and he got out and looked at the property with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who has already decided something. Wilhelmina met him on the porch. Marcus was at the barn but close enough to hear, and he had the good sense not to go away. "I've had some interest in this parcel," Hale said, conversationally, as if he were talking about the weather. "Good grazing land, decent water access. A man I know in Albuquerque is looking to consolidate in this area." "My property is not for sale," Wilhelmina said. "Everything's for sale at the right price," Hale said pleasantly. "Not this." Hale smiled in the way of a man who does not hear what he does not wish to hear. "You're doing well out here on your own. It's a lot for a woman without—" "I have a foreman," Wilhelmina said, which was the first time she had used that word about Marcus, and he heard it from the barn doorway and felt something shift in his chest. Hale glanced toward the barn, saw Marcus, and the pleasantness in his expression did not entirely disappear, but reorganized itself into something that contained a warning. "Ford," he said. He knew Marcus's name, which meant he had been asking around in town. "Hail," Marcus said, coming forward. The two men looked at each other the way men look at each other in these situations, measuring, cataloging. Hale was soft in the body in the way of men who had money to be soft with, but he was not a coward. He was the kind of man who got what he wanted through persistence and through wearing people down, and he had correctly identified Wilhelmina as a woman who was tired in ways she did not show and who could, if enough pressure was applied in the right places, be made to make a decision she did not want to make. "I'll be back," Hale said to Wilhelmina, with a smile that was half courtesy and half threat. He got back in his buggy and went. Wilhelmina stood on the porch looking after him until the buggy disappeared around the bend in the road, and then she turned and went back inside without a word. Marcus followed her because that seemed like the right thing to do. She was at the counter, not doing anything, just standing with her hands flat on the wood, looking at nothing. "He's been out here before?" Marcus asked. "Twice," she said. "Before you came. He's patient. He'll wait until he thinks I'm desperate enough." "Are you?" She turned to look at him, and there was a defiance in it that was so fierce and so tired at the same time that it made something ache in him. "No," she said, "I am not." "Then we'll keep the property in good shape and the herd healthy and give him nothing to point to," Marcus said. "People like that need you to fail. If you don't fail, they move on." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've dealt with his kind before." "Enough times." "All right," she said, which was not a thank you exactly, but meant the same thing. After that, something changed between them, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that temperature changes on a spring day, so gradually that you look up and realize it is warm and cannot say exactly when the warmth arrived. They worked together more deliberately, side by side. She began to tell him things about the property, not as instructions, but as shared information, the way you tell a partner, not an employee. He began to offer opinions not as suggestions waiting to be accepted or rejected, but as contributions to a conversation that was already ongoing between two people with the same interest in the outcome. He noticed things about her that he filed away without examining too closely, because examining them felt like reaching for something he had not been offered. He noticed that she hummed while she worked in the garden quietly, songs he sometimes recognized and sometimes didn't. He noticed that she laughed in a way that surprised him every time, sudden and genuine, and then quickly contained, as if she was startled by the sound of it herself. He noticed that she was kinder to the animals than she was to most people, not in a sentimental way, but in the way of someone who understood that animals and children required a different kind of patience than adults and gave it to them without being asked. He noticed that she was lonely. Not the way he was lonely, which was a large, open, wandering loneliness. Hers was smaller and more specific. It was the loneliness of a woman who had made a life and had no one to share the particulars of it with, no one to tell the small daily things to, no one to carry the weight of knowing with. He thought about this more than was probably wise. In July, there was a problem with one of the cows, a roan named Bess that Wilhelmina had named before she had learned not to name them, and the cow was sick in a way that Marcus recognized from cattle drives as potentially serious. He told Wilhelmina, and she sent for the doctor from town, except the doctor in Harlan Creek was not a veterinarian and was not entirely sure he was a doctor either. But he came out and looked at Bess and said she likely had a respiratory sickness and needed to be separated from the herd. They spent 2 days alternating between the barn and the sick cow, monitoring, doing the small things that can be done and hoping the rest worked itself out. On the second night it was past midnight and the cow was through the worst of it and breathing more easily, and they were both sitting in the hay near the stall, too tired to go back to the house, and Wilhelmina said out of nowhere, "Why do you keep moving?" Marcus leaned back against the stall wall and looked at the lamplight on the barn ceiling. "Easier than stopping," he said. "Is it?" He thought about it honestly, which he did not always do with that question. "It was for a long time. After my family lost the ranch, I was angry for a few years, and moving kept the anger from settling. And then it just became what I did. You do something long enough, you forget there's another way. What would you want? She asked. If you thought about it, what would stopping look like to you? He was quiet for a while. The cow breathed. The lamp made small sounds in the draft. Something like this, he said finally, and did not look at her when he said it. She was quiet too after that, and the silence was not uncomfortable, but it was weighted, and he was aware of it all along his skin, and he thought she was too. Bess is going to be all right, Wilhelmina said, which was a way of moving back to safe ground, and he let her take them there. She is, he agreed. 3 days later, Bess was on the mend. And the following Sunday, when Marcus had come in from the morning's work and was washing up at the basin near the back door, Wilhelmina appeared from the kitchen and said, completely casually, I'm going into town for supplies. You could come if you want. He dried his hands and said, sure. And they went into town in the wagon together, which was a thing they had not done before, and people noticed. The way people notice things in small towns, not intrusively but comprehensively. Clara Briggs noticed from her dry goods counter and smiled to herself. Pete at the livery noticed and thought it made sense. Reverend Walsh at the church noticed and thought Providence had arranged it. In the dry goods store, Wilhelmina moved through her list with efficiency, and he carried things and she talked to Clara and he listened. And once, when she reached past him for something on a shelf, her arm brushed his, and neither of them moved away from it, and neither of them remarked on it, but the warmth of it stayed with him for the rest of the day. On the wagon ride home, the sun was going down over the western hills, and the sky was doing the thing it does in New Mexico in July, turning colors that seemed excessive and necessary in equal measure. Deep orange into purple into a blue so dark it was almost violent. Wilhelmina was driving. She was a better driver than him anyway and did not need to be told so, and he sat beside her and watched the sky. My mother never understood why I came west, she said. She thought it was following a man, which was partly true and partly not. I wanted the space. The space, he repeated. The unfinished feeling of it, she said, searching for the words. In Ohio, everything felt decided already. The land was mapped and deeded and farmed and known. Out here it still feels like it's being decided, like what you do with it matters. She paused. I know that's a particular way of looking at it. The people who were here before us had their own sense of the land being decided. He looked at her. You think about that, don't you? Yes, he said. The territory's changed a lot in the past 20 years, not always in ways that seem like progress. No, she agreed quietly, not always. They rode in silence for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence he had known in years. He looked at her profile against the last of the sunset light, the line of her jaw and the dark hair escaping its pins in the evening breeze, and he thought very clearly and with no particular drama that he was in serious trouble, and that he had been for some time, and that he did not especially mind. August came in fierce and hot, and the work on the property was unrelenting, but it was the kind of work that has purpose behind it, and purpose makes things bearable that would otherwise grind a person down. Marcus repaired the roof of the chicken coop and rebuilt a section of the corral fence and helped Wilhelmina with the herd management, and she worked beside him more often than not because she lacked other things to do, but because, he began to understand, she liked working alongside him. Douglas Hale came back in the middle of August. This time he did not come in a nice buggy. He came on horseback with a man Marcus recognized as Tate Larson, who had a reputation in the territory as someone who did the kinds of things that men like Hale needed done and did not want to be seen doing. Larson was a hard-faced man with small, calculating eyes and a pistol worn low on his hip. They rode up to the gate and did not bother to dismount. Hale called out for Wilhelmina, and Marcus came out of the barn instead, and Wilhelmina came off the porch a moment later, and they stood together in front of the house. I'm here to make a final offer, Hale said. $500 for the property, the buildings, and the herd. Wilhelmina looked at him with an expression that contained in its stillness a considerable fury. The property, the buildings, and the herd are worth 3 times that, she said, and they are not for sale at any price. That's a shame, Hale said conversationally. He looked at Larson, then back at Wilhelmina. You've had a run of bad luck this past year. Another bad season might really put a dent in things. The threat was not subtle. Marcus stepped forward, not aggressively, but so that he was beside Wilhelmina rather than behind her. This conversation is over, he said. Mrs. Wilcox has given you her answer, multiple times. The next time you come on this property uninvited, I'll be considerably less polite about asking you to leave. Larson's hand moved toward his hip, and Marcus stood perfectly still and watched it, and Larson, to his credit or caution, moved it away again. Hale's pleasant expression did not entirely disappear, but it cooled significantly. He looked at Wilhelmina and then at Marcus, calculating. Ford, he said, you've been here, 3 months, you'll move on, you always do. Marcus said nothing, but he felt the words like a small, cold stone dropped into still water, and he felt Wilhelmina feel them too, in the barely perceptible stiffening beside him. Hale and Larson rode away. Wilhelmina and Marcus stood where they were until the sound of the horses faded completely. Then she said, he's not wrong that Larson could cause problems. He could, Marcus agreed. We should send word to the sheriff's office in Santa Fe about Hale's business practices. There are enough people in this area who have had dealings with him that a formal complaint might carry weight. She thought about this. You think they'd act on it? I think it creates a record, he said. It makes him visible. Men like Hale operate best in the dark. All right, she said, and then after a moment quietly, thank you for staying beside me. He looked at her and she was looking at him, and the space between them was very small and full of all the things that had been accumulating since May. He took his time. He thought about what Hale had said, that he would move on, that he always did, and he thought about whether that was still true, and he was quiet for long enough that she seemed to think he was not going to say anything. I don't intend to move on, he said. And then, because he was a man who believed in being clear when clarity was called for, I want to be plain about that. I came here looking for work, and I found it, and I found something else besides. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what that something else is, or that it's just about the work. Wilhelmina was still. Her expression was not what he expected, because he had been bracing, unconsciously, for a practical redirection, a steering back to safe ground. Instead, she looked at him with something direct and unguarded, and she said, How long have you felt that way? Since about 3 weeks in, he said, which made her laugh, that sudden, startled laugh, and the sound of it undid something in his chest that had been knotted for years. About the same, she said. He took her hand, carefully, as if it were something he needed permission for, which he did, and she left her hand in his, which was the permission. They stood there in front of the house in the August heat with his hand around hers, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and it was enough. It was more than enough. For a man who had been in motion for 15 years, standing still like this, with someone beside him, was almost more than he could take in at once, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him that this was what he had been tired for. The motion had been tiring him toward this place, this woman, this stopped moment. They did not rush. This was August, and what followed was weeks of things being the same and different simultaneously, the work continuing and the hours keeping their shape, but something new running beneath it all, unhurried and certain. He kissed her for the first time in September, on the porch in the evening, when the air had finally relented from the worst of the heat, and they were sitting with their coffee, and the conversation had wandered somewhere quiet, and she had turned to say something and found him already looking at her, and the kiss was very simple, neither tentative nor urgent, but honest, which was the only way either of them knew how to do anything. She put her hand against his jaw for a moment after, looked at him. You're staying, she said. I'm staying, he said. Good, she said. The letter they sent to the sheriff's office in Santa Fe regarding Douglas Hale's land speculation practices went in October, signed by Wilhelmina and Marcus, and also by two other property owners in the area whom Marcus had spoken to privately, both of whom had their own grievances against Hale's methods. The letter outlined specific instances where Hale had used intimidation and implied threats in his dealings, and named Tate Larson as a man who had accompanied him for purposes of that intimidation. The response came in November. A deputy from Santa Fe came through Harlan Creek and made inquiries and took statements. Hale was brought in for a formal conversation. Larson, whether out of good sense or foreknowledge, had already left the territory. The investigation did not result in a dramatic arrest or trial because the law in the New Mexico Territory in 1882 was still very much a thing of degrees and limitations. But it resulted in Hale's operations being made considerably more visible and his reputation among property owners in the area being made considerably less useful to him. He did not come back to the Wilcox property. By November, Marcus Ford had been on the Wilcox property for 6 months, and he was still there, and he was not going to be leaving. He had put this to Wilhelmina in the plainest terms he had one evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, and he had said that he wanted to be clear again about what he meant by staying, that he did not mean for the season or until the work ran out, but permanently, if she would have him. He had said it the way he said most things, directly and without ornamentation, and she had listened in the way she listened to most things, completely and without hurrying him. And then she had said, also directly, that she thought that was a good idea, and that she had been thinking it was a good idea for some time, and that she did not want anything elaborate, no fuss and no ceremony beyond what was necessary. They were married in December in the church at the end of Harlan Creek's Main Street by Reverend Walsh, who was very pleased about it, with Clara Briggs and Pete from the livery as witnesses. Wilhelmina wore a dress that was dark blue and was the nicest dress she owned, and Marcus wore his only good shirt and a coat he had bought in Santa Fe on a supply run in November. There were no more than a dozen people present, which was exactly what both of them wanted. The ceremony was brief and honest, and the vows were the traditional ones and meant every syllable. Clara Briggs cried, which she would have denied vigorously, and Pete looked solemn in the way of young men who are determined to treat an occasion with gravity. Afterward, they rode home in the wagon in the cold December air, and the stars were very bright and the land was very quiet, and Wilhelmina sat close against him against the cold, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they were home in 20 minutes, and they made supper together and ate at their table, and the fire in the stove was warm. He lay in bed that night in the dark with his wife asleep beside him and the whole enormous fact of it around him, the property, the walls, the roof, the particular silence of a house rather than the open air, and he felt it all the way in, the warmth and the permanence of it, and he thought that he had not known before this what it was to arrive somewhere, to not be leaving. He had not understood the weight that constant motion cost you until he put it down. He did not pick it back up. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold but manageable, and they managed it together, which made a considerable difference. Marcus learned the rhythms of the property in the cold months, and Wilhelmina learned what it was to share the decisions and the weight of them with someone who was reliable and sharp and present. They had disagreements, because they were both people with strong opinions and neither of them was in the habit of folding when they thought they were right, and the disagreements were often vigorous and occasionally very heated, but they always resolved them, because underneath the arguments was a bedrock of mutual respect and the willingness to hear the other person, actually hear them, which is rarer in a marriage than it ought to be. Spring of 1883 came, and with it, the decision to expand the herd. This was a calculated risk. Cattle prices were reasonable, and the grazing land on the south end of the property had been underused. Marcus had been tracking the market through newspapers and through conversations with ranchers in the area, and his assessment was that they could take on 12 more head and see a meaningful return if the year was not catastrophically bad. Wilhelmina agreed after going through the ledger thoroughly and adding her own analysis, which was always precise and occasionally reminded him that she was considerably better with numbers than he was. They bought the cattle from a rancher named Alvarado 2 counties over, a man whose family had been in this part of the territory since before it was a territory, and whose knowledge of the land and the cattle was extensive. Marcus liked him immediately. Alvarado shook his hand and looked at him squarely and treated Wilhelmina as a competent business partner, which she was, and she had a conversation with him in Spanish that Marcus could follow only partially, but that clearly impressed Alvarado. She had been learning Spanish since her first year in the territory, she told Marcus on the ride home, because she had decided early on that if she was going to live in a place, she was going to understand it properly. He looked at her with the fresh appreciation that marriage kept producing, this steady revelation of new dimensions. "Is there anything you decided not to learn?" he asked. She thought about it. "How to make pie," she said. "I decided life was too short." He laughed and she laughed, and the wagon wheels turned on the road home. Summer of 1883 was good in the ways that matter and hard in the ways that were inevitable. The expanded herd required more work, but the work was good work, and Marcus hired a hand on a seasonal basis, a young man from Harlan Creek named Everett who was honest and eager and knew enough to be useful. Wilhelmina managed the kitchen garden and the chickens and the ledger and 100 other things, and Marcus managed the range and the repairs and the 1,000 daily demands of the land. And in the middle of August of 1883, Wilhelmina told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before work, in the kitchen with the coffee on, and her expression had in it an anxiety and a hope in equal measure. And he crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and he said, "That is the best thing you have ever told me," which he meant absolutely, and she laughed and pressed her forehead against his shoulder and stayed there for a moment, and he held her there, and the morning went quiet around them. The child was born in April of 1884, and the birth was hard in the way that first births often are, and Marcus spent 6 hours outside the bedroom door, while a woman named Mrs. Castellano, who had been a midwife for 30 years, was inside, and he spent those 6 hours in a state of fear that he would never afterward speak of in detail, because it was too large and too personal to describe. But when the door opened and Mrs. Castellano said it was done and mother and baby were well, he went into that room, and his wife was pale and exhausted and looking at him with a kind of profound accomplishment and love in her eyes, and in her arms was a small, red-faced, furious boy. "A son," Wilhelmina said, and her voice was tired and warm and proud. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was small beyond believing, and he felt something so large move through him that he had no word for it and did not try to find one. He put his finger in the baby's fist, and the baby held it with a grip that was surprisingly firm for something so new. They named him Elias Marcus Ford, Elias for Wilhelmina's first husband, who deserved to be remembered and not erased from the story of her life, and Marcus because the boy was his in a way that still astonished him. The naming of the child Elias was Marcus's idea, offered quietly one evening before the birth, and Wilhelmina had looked at him when he said it with an expression that was not quite crying and not quite smiling, and was somewhere between the two that only happened when something true had been recognized. Harlan Creek heard about the baby, and behaved in the way of small towns, which is to say a great deal of food appeared on the Wilcox Ford property in the following weeks, pies and stews and breads arriving with women who wanted to see the baby and men who wanted to shake Marcus's hand, and everyone who wanted to be part of the good news of it. Clara Briggs held little Elias for nearly 20 minutes and said he had his father's chin and his mother's eyes, which was not precisely accurate but was kind. Pete from the livery came out and looked at the baby solemnly and said he was a good-looking boy, which was the highest compliment Pete was capable of and was delivered with complete sincerity. The baby changed things in the way that babies do, fundamentally and in ways that could not have been anticipated. The property, which had always been a place of work and of quiet companionship, became something more, became a place where a family was establishing itself, where a future was being built room by room and season by season. Marcus felt this shift as a deepening, not a replacement of what had been before but an addition to it, a new layer of meaning laid over the existing ones. He walked the property lines at dawn sometimes, when the baby was still sleeping and Wilhelmina was sleeping too, and he would stand at the far fence and look back at the house in the early morning light, the adobe with the porch and the window boxes and the smoke beginning to rise from the chimney, and he would think that this was his. Not in the way of possession, but in the way of belonging. He belonged here. After 31, 32, 33 years of belonging nowhere, he belonged to this particular piece of earth and this particular woman, and now this particular small, determined child who had the loudest voice Marcus had ever heard in something so small. In the fall of 1884, the territorial government began a process of reorganizing land deeds in the area, a bureaucratic process that had significant implications for property owners, particularly those like Wilhelmina who had inherited their deeds and whose paperwork was not in perfect order. This was the kind of thing that could, if handled badly, cause serious problems. Marcus spent 3 weeks in correspondence with a territorial surveyor and a lawyer in Albuquerque named Portillo, who came highly recommended by Alvarado and who was worth every penny of his fee. The deed was confirmed, updated, and recorded in both names, Wilhelmina Ford and Marcus Ford. When the papers came back, Wilhelmina sat at the kitchen table with them in her hands and read her name on the deed and looked up at him across the table with an expression that was satisfaction and security and something deeper. "We did it," she said. "We did," he said. By 1885, little Elias was walking, which was chaotic, because he had inherited his mother's energy and her father's complete fearlessness, and the combination produced a small human being who was into everything at all times and had no concept of danger that applied to himself. He fell off the porch step 11 times before he decided to be cautious about the porch step, and Marcus watched each fall with his heart in his throat, and Wilhelmina watched each fall with an expression of resigned maternal love. The boy was fine. The boy was very fine. He was also, by age 1, clearly in love with the horses, which Marcus took as a very good sign, and which Wilhelmina took as an inevitability that she had already prepared herself for. Marcus began teaching him the names of things, the horses, the tools, the parts of the saddle, and the boy absorbed all of it with the seriousness of someone who understood that this information mattered, which was the funniest and the most moving thing Marcus had ever watched. He would hold little Elias up on the fence rail of the corral and point to the horses, one by one, and the boy would say the names in the careful, deliberate way of a child learning that words are precise instruments. Cutter Bess, the new gelding they had acquired and named Ajax because Elias' mother had named him when she was feeling literary. Douglas Hale was gone from the territory by 1885. Marcus heard this from Clara Briggs, who had heard it from the postmaster, who had heard it from the deputy who had come through the previous year. Hale had moved his operations to Arizona Territory, which had its own complications waiting for him. Marcus received this news with equanimity. He had never wasted much energy hating Hale. He had simply done what was necessary to remove the problem, and the problem had removed itself. The years that followed had the quality of good years do, full and varied, and sometimes hard and often wonderful, not a straight line, but an accumulation of days that built into something real and solid and worth having. Everett, their seasonal hand, became permanent by 1886, because there was enough work and they trusted him, and he had nowhere particularly urgent to be. He was a quiet young man who was grateful for stable employment, and who, Marcus noticed, began making rather pointed and transparent excuses to visit the dry goods store when Clara Briggs's niece, a young woman named Annette, was visiting in the summer of 1886. Marcus said nothing about this, but Wilhelmina said several things about it to Marcus privately, and they watched this unfold with the comfortable amusement of people who remember what early love looks like from the inside. In 1887, Wilhelmina told Marcus she was expecting again. She told him in the kitchen again, morning again, and this time her expression was different, less anxious and more settled, because she knew now how this worked and who would be beside her through it, and the knowing made it different. He crossed the kitchen again, kissed her forehead again, and said, "This is still the best kind of news." The second child was a girl, born in March of 1888, and the birth was shorter than the first and left Wilhelmina tired but considerably less depleted. The girl was born with dark hair that stuck up in all directions and an expression of absolute dignity that she maintained even in her first hours, and Marcus fell completely in love with her the moment he was allowed into the room. They named her Clara Ruth Ford, Clara for the woman who had, without knowing it, pointed Marcus toward the Wilcox property all those years ago with an offhand mention over a dry goods counter, and Ruth because it was Wilhelmina's mother's name, and her mother was still alive in Ohio, still writing letters that were equal parts love and bewilderment at the direction her daughter's life had taken, and this seemed like a good time to close that gap a little. When the letter arrived in Ohio telling of the baby and her name, Wilhelmina's mother wrote back a letter that was 6 pages long and wet in spots, and that said, among many other things, that she would like to come and visit. And she did, in the summer of 1888, arriving by train to Albuquerque, and then by stage to Harlan Creek. A journey that she regarded with a combination of horror and determination that Wilhelmina found absolutely recognizable as the expression she herself sometimes wore when faced with an unavoidable difficulty. Wilhelmina's mother, whose name was Helen, was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who wore her opinions on the outside and did not suffer fools. She arrived at the property and looked at it with the thorough assessment of a woman who had imagined this place for 6 years and was now measuring the reality against the imagining. She looked at the house and the barn and the kitchen garden and the chickens. She looked at little Elias, who was 4 years old, and immediately showed her his knowledge of horse names, which she absorbed with serious attention. She looked at baby Clara Ruth, who looked back at her grandmother with that expression of absolute dignity. And then she looked at Marcus Ford, who had been standing a little to the side, giving the family its space. Helen looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You're the man my daughter chose." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She looked at him a while longer. "She has good judgment," she said, and that was that. Helen stayed for 6 weeks, which was longer than anyone had planned and was extended by mutual, unspoken agreement, because she was useful, extraordinarily useful, and she and Wilhelmina talked for 6 weeks in the way they had not been able to talk in 6 years, and whatever distance had grown between them in those years, not of feeling but of understanding, closed itself. When Helen left, Wilhelmina was quiet for a day, and then she was herself again, but Marcus noticed that she wrote to her mother more frequently after that, and the letters were longer. By 1889, Elias was 5 and already following Marcus around the property with absolute seriousness, carrying things, handing tools, asking questions in a steady stream that Marcus answered with equal seriousness, because he believed that questions from a child deserved real answers, not dismissal or condescension. Elias wanted to know how the water pump worked, and Marcus explained it, and the boy's face went through a sequence of expressions that Marcus privately saved up to think about on the days when work was hard, first confusion, then effort, then understanding, and then the particular delight of a mind that has just gotten around a corner and found new territory on the other side. Clara Ruth, at 1 year old, was steady on her feet, and had the same approach to the world as her brother, which was to pursue it with complete commitment and no particular fear. She had decided that Cutter the horse was her specific friend, which the horse seemed to accept with bemused equanimity, and she could often be found at the fence of the corral holding a piece of grass through the rails, solemn and purposeful. The property was in the best shape it had ever been in. The herd was healthy and the ledger was in the black, not dramatically, not in any way that would draw attention, but consistently and increasingly so. They had added a small addition to the house in 1888, a proper bedroom for the children, because Elias had been sleeping in the main room, and the arrangement had its limitations. The addition was Marcus's work primarily, and he had built it with Everett's help and with considerable input from Wilhelmina about what she wanted, and the result was solid and warm and exactly right. In the evenings now, when the children were asleep and the work was done, Marcus and Wilhelmina would sit on the porch in the cooling air, and there was about these evenings a quality of completeness that Marcus had not known was possible before, not a quality of nothing left to do, because there was always something left to do, but a quality of rightness, of being in the place you were meant to be. He had said to her once in their second year of marriage that he did not fully understand what had made him stop here in Harlan Creek when he had passed through 100 towns without stopping, and she had said that she had asked herself the same question, what had made her set a plate on the porch for a dusty stranger rather than send him away and let him find work in town, and neither of them had a clean answer to it. "I think," she said, "that some things are recognized rather than decided." He thought about that for a long time. He thought it was true. He had recognized something in that first moment, in the sharp assessment of her eyes, in the soup set on the porch rail without ceremony, in the quality of the silence she kept. He had recognized, without knowing he was doing it, a kindred precision. Two people who meant what they said and said what they meant and did not make a ceremony of the things that were simply necessary. Two people who had been surviving and had the capacity, given the right conditions, to do something more than that. On a September evening in 1889, they were sitting on the porch in the last of the evening light, and the children were in bed, and Cutter was standing at the far fence in the dusk, and the property was quiet in the way that feels earned rather than empty, and Wilhelmina was leaning against him in the way she had developed the habit of, her shoulder against his arm, and she said, "Are you happy?" It was not a question she asked often, and he gave it the respect of a real answer. He sat with it, feeling the weight of the word and what it meant, and he looked out at the property, the fence lines and the barn and the kitchen garden going to seed in the fall, and the sky going dark above the western hills, and he felt the warmth of her beside him and the knowledge of the children sleeping behind the walls, and he said, "Yes, truly," she said. "Truly," he said, "more than I knew was available." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I used to think that surviving was enough. After Elias died, I thought if I could just hold the property and keep moving, that was sufficient. I didn't think there was more. And now I think surviving was the floor," she said, "and we've been building above it for 7 years." He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and the evening settled around them, and the stars came out one by one over the New Mexico hills. It was Everett in the end who got around to asking Annette to marry him in the fall of 1889, and the asking involved considerable preparation and a conversation with Marcus beforehand, during which Everett was so nervous he forgot what he wanted to say, and Marcus had to very quietly prompt him back to the point, and Wilhelmina, who had been aware of the conversation through the kitchen window and was technically just cooking, was nearly useless for the rest of the afternoon from suppressed amusement. Annette said yes, with a promptness that suggested she had been waiting for him to get around to it for some time. They were married in the church in Harlan Creek the following spring, and Marcus and Wilhelmina stood as witnesses, and little Elias sat in the front pew with his best serious expression on, and Clara Ruth fell asleep during the ceremony, which Clara Briggs in the row behind thought was adorable and which was, in fact, adorable. The years continued to build. By 1891, Elias could ride. He was 7 years old, and he sat on Cutter's back with a gravity that suggested he felt the full significance of the privilege, which Marcus had taken considerable care to convey to him, not with lectures but with example, the way you treat a horse, the respect you owe an animal that is giving you something. The boy had absorbed this entirely, and rode with a care for the horse that Marcus found deeply satisfying to watch. Clara Ruth at 3 was verbal in a way that kept the entire household very well informed about her opinions at all times, and her opinions were many and frequently compelling and occasionally inconvenient, and Marcus adored her completely. She had decided, around the time she began speaking in complete sentences, that Marcus was the funniest person she knew, and she approached him with a cheerful confidence that he would do whatever she needed that was both entirely inaccurate and yet somehow mostly accurate, because he found it very difficult to refuse her anything that was reasonable and even some things that were not. Wilhelmina watched him with their daughter with the same warmth she watched him with their son, a warmth she did not perform but simply had, the quiet kind. He caught her watching him one morning across the yard, when he had Clara Ruth on his shoulders and the little girl was narrating everything she could see from that height, which was everything, the whole property, the hills, the horses, the particular cloud formation above them, all of it described with great authority. He caught Wilhelmina watching, and she did not look away. She held his gaze across the yard and the years and smiled at him, and it was a smile that was not guarded or managed or careful, a smile that was simply true. He shifted Clara Ruth on his shoulders and walked across the yard to her, and she reached up and put her hand against his face the way she had done that September evening in their first year when they kissed for the first time, and he covered her hand with his, and Clara Ruth on his shoulders said very clearly, "What are you doing?" "Saying hello to your mother," Marcus said. "You already said hello to her," Clara Ruth said. "Some hellos deserve more than one saying," Wilhelmina said, and kissed him once gently, and Clara Ruth made a sound of magnificent exasperation that made both of her parents laugh. In the autumn of 1891, they had a visitor that Marcus had not expected. A letter came, which was not unusual, but this one was from Texas, which was unusual, because he had not communicated with anyone in Texas since he was 18 years old. It was from a woman named Susan Ford, who was his sister, 3 years younger, who had been 12 when the family scattered, and who he had lost track of in the years of moving. She had tracked him through the territorial record, through Harlan Creek's postmaster, through the stubbornness of a woman who had decided it was time to find her brother. She was 31 years old, she wrote. She was living in San Antonio with her husband, a man named Garrett, and they had 2 children. She had been looking for him on and off for 4 years. She hoped he was well. She hoped very much he was well. Marcus sat with that letter for a long time. He showed it to Wilhelmina, who read it and then looked at him with clear eyes and said, "Write back." He wrote back. He told her about the property and about Wilhelmina and about Elias and Clara Ruth and about the years since Texas, not all of it, but enough. He told her he was glad she had found him. The letter that came back from Susan was longer than the first one and contained, at the bottom, a sketch she had made from memory of their parents' faces, and he had to sit still for a while when he saw that. They arranged, through several more letters, a visit for the following spring. Susan and Garrett and their 2 children came to Harlan Creek in April of 1892, and the meeting between Marcus and his sister, after 23 years, took place on the porch of the Wilcox Ford property in the morning light. And it was not dramatic, which was appropriate because neither of them were dramatic people, but it was complete in the way that something long broken being set right is complete, not loud, but thorough. The children played together in the yard within an hour, which was how children are, and Susan and Wilhelmina sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 days, which was how women of similar intelligence and directness are when they find each other. Garrett was a solid, straightforward man who talked about cattle and weather with the comprehensive fluency of a Texan, and he and Marcus got along on the basis of mutual practicality and a shared joke about the particular arrogance of New Mexico's weather system. When Susan and her family left to return to Texas, she and Marcus stood on the road for a moment and she said, "You look like someone who finally stopped." "I did," he said. "It looks good on you," she said. He watched the wagon take them down the road toward town, and then he turned back to the property, and Wilhelmina was in the kitchen garden, and Elias was at the barn, and Clara Ruth was doing something inexplicable near the water pump, and the whole beautiful, ordinary machinery of his life was running in front of him, and he stood there for a moment just looking at it. He had been, he thought, a man without a compass for the better part of his adult life, not because he lacked direction, but because direction requires a destination, and he had not had one. He had been following work, following the open land, following whatever the next day brought and then the next, and all of it had been a kind of preparation for stopping, though he had not known it. The preparation had lasted 15 years and brought him to a woman who had set a plate on her porch rail and not made a ceremony of it, who had fed him and looked at him and given him work, and who had, without any unnecessary fuss, become the center of everything. He went back through the gate and across the yard to the kitchen garden and crouched down beside her. "Everything all right?" she said, without looking up from what she was doing, which was thinning out the seedlings with the precise, unsentimental efficiency she brought to all gardening tasks. "Everything is exactly right," he said. She glanced at him sideways, and the look she gave him contained everything. The sharp brown eyes that had assessed him from a doorway in May of 1882, and the 7 years of days between then and now, and the children and the cattle and the repaired fences, and the fought arguments and the shared silences, and the things that had been difficult, and the things that had been wonderful, and all the ordinary warm days that had built, stone by stone, into a life so solid he could feel it under his feet when he stood. "Good," she said, "hand me that." He handed her the trowel and stayed crouched beside her in the dirt while she worked, and the sun was warm on his back, and the children were making the sounds that children make when they are fully occupied, and Cutter stood at the fence looking at nothing in particular with the philosophical calm of a horse who has had enough good days to trust in more, and Harlan Creek sat 2 miles north going about its contracting, stubborn, surviving business. And the land spread out in every direction the way it always had and always would, wide and indifferent and beautiful, and all of it, every piece of it, was his, and not because he owned it, but because he belonged to it, the way you belong to a place when you have decided to stop being in motion and let the land hold you, and it has agreed to. Clara Ruth at some point in the following 10 minutes discovered the water pump and got completely wet, which she was absolutely delighted about and which Marcus and Wilhelmina were, independently and simultaneously, entirely unsurprised by. "Elias," Marcus called toward the barn. "What?" Elias appeared in the barn doorway. "Your sister." Elias looked at Clara Ruth, who was standing soaking wet beside the pump with an expression of absolute self-satisfaction. "She did that on purpose," he said. "Absolutely she did," Marcus agreed. "She does everything on purpose," Elias said, which was the most accurate thing anyone had said all morning. Wilhelmina called Clara Ruth in to be changed, which Clara Ruth disagreed with but eventually submitted to, and Marcus went back to the afternoon's work, which was repairing a section of the north fence that the roan bull had been resting his considerable weight against, until it had expressed its dissatisfaction with the arrangement. In the late afternoon, he came back to the house and washed up, and the kitchen smelled like supper, and Elias was inside telling his mother about something that had happened with one of the calves, telling her in the serious, earnest way he had, and Clara Ruth was drawing on a piece of paper at the table with the focused intensity of a person who has decided that what she is drawing is very important, and the lamp was on, and the stove was warm, and Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment looking at all of it. He thought of himself on the road in early May of 1882, riding Cutter into Harlan Creek with nothing to his name and no direction that mattered, and the specific tiredness of a man who has been surviving without any particular reason to do so well. He thought of the biscuits eaten standing up at Clara Briggs's counter. He thought of the road out to the Wilcox property, the crooked gate, the brave purple flowers in the window boxes. He thought of a woman in a gray dress appearing in a doorway with sharp eyes and practical questions, and behind all of it, a kindness she expressed not in sentiment but in action, in a bowl of soup set on a porch rail for a stranger without ceremony, without obligation, without anything more than the simple recognition that here was a person who needed a warm meal and she had one. That bowl of soup. He thought about it sometimes and knew that it was not simply food, that it had never been only food, that the setting of it on that rail without ceremony was the most elegant thing anyone had ever done for him, because it did not require him to be grateful in a way that cost him dignity. It simply fed him and let him be, and that was what he had needed. He stepped inside and Elias looked up and said, "Pa, did you know a calf can walk within an hour of being born?" Which was a fact he had known for 15 years, and which he received with exactly the same interest he would have given it if he had never heard it before, because the important thing was not the information but the boy delivering it. "I did know that," Marcus said, "but tell me more. What did this one do?" And Elias told him in detail, and Clara Ruth looked up from her drawing to add things that were largely unrelated, but that she felt were important to mention. And Wilhelmina turned from the stove and met his eyes across the room, and her expression said everything that did not need saying aloud. All of it. The years and the work and the love and the life they had built in this place, and the gladness of it. He went to her, because that was where he went when given the choice, and he stood beside her at the stove, and she put her hand briefly on his arm and went back to what she was doing, and he leaned against the counter and watched her and watched the children, and the warmth of the room was the warmth of the stove and of the lamps, and of the bodies of people who were glad to be in the same place. And outside the land was going blue in the dusk, and the stars were beginning, and Cutter was in his stall, and everything was as it should be. He had not eaten a warm meal inside 4 walls in months, that man who had ridden into Harlan Creek in the spring of 1882. And then someone had set a plate on a porch and not made a ceremony of it, and he had eaten, and then he had stayed, and staying had turned into something he could not have imagined when he was still in motion, something complete and warm and full, a life that was not just survived but chosen, not just endured but loved. All of it growing out of a bowl of soup on a porch rail. All of it beginning with an ordinary act of simple, unceremonious kindness. He thought it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever known, and he had never found any more dramatic words for it than that, and he did not need them. Supper was ready, and they sat down together at the table, the 4 of them, and Marcus Ford, who had been nowhere in particular for most of his life, was exactly where he belonged,